The story of why the Soviet Union really fell in 1991 does not begin in its final years, with Gorbachev pacing anxiously through the Kremlin's long corridors, or with the desperate coup plotters in August of that year scrambling to cling to a collapsing order. It begins decades earlier, with a system that was already showing cracks even as it reached the height of its power. To understand the fall, we must step backward, not forward, because the seeds of collapse were planted long before anyone dared imagine the Soviet flag would ever be lowered for the last time. As we travel through this long arc of history, imagine yourself walking through the events, one moment after another, and if you enjoy deep historical journeys like this, make sure to stay with this documentary and consider supporting channels that bring stories like this to life, stories that often take hours of digging and piecing together. But for now, let us begin where the first fractures appeared. In the 1950s, after the death of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union stood towering over half of Europe and stretching across 11 time zones. On paper, it seemed invincible, a nuclear superpower, a victorious ally in the Second World War, and leader of a vast ideological movement that promised equality and a radiant future. Yet beneath this triumph lay contradictions so deep that even the most loyal party members sometimes sensed the weight of them. Stalin's terror had frozen society, but it had also prevented anyone from openly discussing the inefficiencies, corruption, and fear that defined daily life. When Nikita Khrushchev came to power, he attempted to thaw the nation, to break apart the frozen terror and let the Soviet system breathe again. But he soon discovered that once you thaw something brittle, it doesn't melt smoothly, it cracks. During the post-Stalin thaw, Khrushchev gave his famous secret speech in 1956, denouncing Stalin's cult of personality. The move was meant to revive socialism by cleansing it of its darkest excesses. Instead, it plunged the communist world into confusion. Imagine being a young member of the Communist Party, raised on the belief that Stalin had been the fatherly guardian of the revolution, only to be told now that the man was a tyrant. If the myth had cracked, what else was untrue? Khrushchev didn't intend to undermine the faith of millions, but he did. And yet, his reforms did not dismantle the authoritarian state. It was still the same system, only wobbling, unsure of its ideological footing. This wobble would echo for decades. The economy, meanwhile, looked impressive on the surface. In the early post-war years, the Soviet Union experienced fast industrialization, tremendous growth in heavy industry, and dramatic transformations in agriculture. But this growth was not built on innovation or efficiency. It was built on mobilizing massive labor, extracting raw resources, and funneling state priorities into big, flashy projects. The deeper structural problem was that the system rewarded meeting quotas rather than creating quality. Factories produced absurd volumes of goods that few wanted and shortages of the simplest items. Shoes, basic tools, household goods became routine. But because the state controlled everything, there was no competition, no customer feedback, no market pressure. The system drifted like a huge ship with no one allowed to adjust its course. By the mid-1960s, after Khrushchev was ousted, Leonid Brezhnev took over and brought stability. But the stability he created was the kind a lake has in winter, still, quiet, and frozen. The Brezhnev years are sometimes remembered inside Russia as peaceful and predictable, but they were also suffocating. The ruling elite grew older, corruption grew thicker, and the economy slowed so dramatically that the term stagnation became attached to the era like a shadow. For the average Soviet citizen, life was not unbearable, far from it. There was work for everyone, basic needs were generally met, and the threat of mass terror was gone. But the system offered no sense of future, no dynamism, no room for personal ambition beyond what the state approved. A citizen could spend years in line waiting for a cheap car or live in a cramped apartment, but the unspoken agreement was that they would accept these realities in exchange for stability. That stability would, however, come at the price of rot from within. Under Brezhnev, the military grew massive and technologically sophisticated, especially in missiles and heavy forces, but civilian industries were left behind. As the rest of the world entered the era of personal electronics, computing, global communication, and consumer innovation, the Soviet Union remained stuck in an industrial model from the 1950s. A command economy cannot pivot easily. If the state decides that refrigerator factories produce two types, then those two types are what the entire nation gets regardless of changing needs. This inability to adapt became one of the fundamental causes of the Soviet downfall. And while we explore these long-term trends, if you find this kind of historical unraveling fascinating, feel free to follow along through this series, because there are many more stories like this that deserve to be told in full detail. Every listener and supporter helps keep long-form history alive. Another force at play was the rising strain of maintaining the Soviet Empire. The Warsaw Pact and the broader Eastern Bloc required constant political pressure, military readiness, and financial aid. Countries like Poland, East Germany, and Romania each had their own internal issues, and controlling them took enormous energy. When uprisings occurred, like the Prague Spring in 1968, the Soviet response required military intervention, sending tanks into Czechoslovakia to crush reforms. Each intervention not only cost money, but eroded the moral prestige of the communist project. How can a system claim to be liberating humanity when it suppresses freedom movements in allied nations? This contradiction would deepen mistrust and resentment in the Eastern Bloc, which would erupt fully in the 1980s. Meanwhile, the United States remained a constant rival. The arms race drained Soviet resources, but Soviet leaders believed they could not reduce military spending without falling behind. During the Cold War, military might became a symbol of legitimacy. So as civilian life stagnated, the military-industrial complex ballooned. Entire regions of the Soviet Union were devoted to building missiles, tanks, and bombers, while food production suffered chronic failures. In fact, by the 1970s, the Soviet Union, one of the largest agricultural nations on Earth, was importing grain from the United States just to feed its population. That dependence was a shocking indicator of systemic dysfunction. As Brezhnev aged, power became concentrated in a small circle of elderly officials, often jokingly referred to as the gerontocracy. Policy innovation ground to a halt. The idea that socialism needed reform was whispered in academic circles and discussed cautiously among younger bureaucrats, but no one dared to challenge the old guard. The fear of destabilizing the system was too great, and yet the system was already destabilizing. Demographic problems, such as declining life expectancy among men, rising alcoholism, and low productivity, created social tension. Ethnic republics within the Soviet Union began feeling alienated from Moscow. The Baltic states, the Caucasus, and Central Asia all had their own identities, which decades of forced Sovietization could not erase. Then came the early 1980s, a time of relentless funerals at the Kremlin. Brezhnev died in 1982. Yuri Andropov, who succeeded him, died in 1984. Konstantin Chernenko, the next leader, died in 1985 after barely a year in office. Each funeral was broadcast live, with rigid Soviet ceremonial music echoing across the television screens of millions. These were moments that reminded citizens, often subtly, that their leadership was literally dying out. The state looked ancient, tired, unable to move with the world. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he was young by Soviet standards, only 54, and energetic, articulate, and determined to save the Soviet Union, not dismantle it. He believed deeply in socialism, but also believed that the system needed modernization and openness. His great irony was that the very policies he introduced to save the Soviet state, glasnost and perestroika, became the forces that tore it apart. Glasnost, meaning openness, encouraged public discussion and criticism. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens could read about Stalin's crimes, the failures of the economy, environmental disasters, and suppressed history. This freedom of information unleashed decades of bottled-up anger and questions. The state suddenly had to answer for everything it had hidden. At the same time, perestroika, meaning restructuring, attempted to fix the economy by introducing limited market mechanisms and reducing central planning. But this halfway reform created chaos. Factories didn't know whether to follow state orders or market signals. Prices became unpredictable. Shortages worsened, not improved. And because the state still set many prices artificially low, goods disappeared into the growing black market. People began hoarding. Lines grew longer. Workers grew frustrated. The notion that the Soviet economy simply needed a few adjustments proved disastrously wrong. The entire system was inherently flawed, and minor reforms only destabilized the fragile balance. Meanwhile, in the republics, nationalist movements surged. For decades, the Soviet government had suppressed local languages, cultures, and histories under a unified Soviet identity. Now, with Glasnost, these regions rediscovered their voices. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania moved toward independence. Georgia protested Moscow's control. Ukraine and Belarus began reconsidering their place in the Union. Central Asia faced ethnic conflict and economic discontent. The Soviet Union was not a single nation. It was a federation of 15 republics, each with its own identity and historical memory. Once the fear barrier fell, many of these republics saw independence as their natural destiny. Externally, the Cold War was shifting. The United States under Ronald Reagan had escalated pressure, and the Soviet Union was struggling economically to keep up. But Gorbachev negotiated nuclear reduction treaties and sought to reduce the military burden. Critics inside the USSR accused him of weakness, while many in the West saw him as a visionary. Yet these foreign policy successes did nothing to reverse the internal economic crisis. By the late 1980s, the Soviet economy was spiraling. Inflation rose, food distribution faltered, and store shelves emptied. The black market became essential for survival. The social contract that had held the Soviet Union together, that citizens would support the state in return for basic stability, was broken. And as we peel back these layers of history, remember that there are countless stories like this, where massive systems rise and fall not from a single event, but from decades of pressure, building silently beneath the surface. If you enjoy these deep explorations, staying connected ensures you won't miss the next episode in this unfolding narrative. The final blow, although not yet visible in this first chapter of our story, would come soon. But to understand the fall in 1991, we must continue through the chain of failures, reforms, and unintended consequences that shaped the last years of the Soviet experiment. As the 1980s moved toward their turbulent conclusion, ordinary Soviet citizens began to sense that something was deeply wrong, something that could no longer be blamed on temporary shortages, seasonal problems, or bureaucratic hiccups. Daily life, once predictable and stable, was now laced with uncertainty. The atmosphere in Soviet cities changed almost imperceptibly at first. People who had long grown accustomed to scarcity were now encountering empty shelves that stayed empty for weeks. Soap, sugar, meat, butter, even toilet paper, goods taken for granted in many parts of the world, were now sporadic at best. Lines had always been part of the Soviet experience, but these lines grew longer, nervously impatient, stretching around buildings and across courtyards. Mothers would stand for hours hoping to get milk for their children, and pensioners woke before dawn just for a chance at bread. The system had faltered before, but now it seemed to be trembling. This unraveling in daily life is often overlooked when discussing the fall of the USSR, but it played a crucial role in the psychology of collapse. People do not revolt because of abstract theories. They revolt or cease believing when the refrigerator is empty. By 1988, the Soviet planned economy was losing any semblance of coordination. One region had surplus coal, but no trucks to deliver it. Another region had trucks, but no spare parts to keep them running. Factories had workers, but no raw materials. Farmers had land, but no functioning distribution system. This fragmentation created resentment within the republics. Why, for example, should a farmer in Ukraine or Kazakhstan continue supplying Moscow if Moscow gave nothing back? Why should the Baltic states, which were economically more efficient, continue subsidizing less developed regions? These questions, whispered privately for years, were now spoken openly in newspapers and public meetings thanks to glasnost. The system's internal tensions were no longer hidden. They were being broadcast to millions. Even so, many citizens still hoped that reform would eventually bear fruit. They believed, or wanted to believe, that Gorbachev knew what he was doing. After all, he had charm, intellect, and youth, qualities absent from the leadership for decades. But Gorbachev was attempting something nearly impossible, reforming a system that resisted reform at every level. Imagine trying to repair an airplane while flying through a storm, with every mechanic giving you different instructions and half the engine parts refusing to fit together. That was perestroika. And as you follow these complexities, remember that bringing such stories to life takes considerable work. So feel free to stay connected for more long-form historical narratives like this as we continue our exploration. One of Gorbachev's earliest reforms was the anti-alcohol campaign launched in 1985. Alcoholism had become a severe social and economic problem in the Soviet Union, reducing productivity, damaging public health, and burdening families. Gorbachev believed that combating it would be a symbolic and practical step toward revitalization. But the campaign backfired disastrously. By restricting alcohol sales and shutting down many distilleries, the government unintentionally created a massive black market for homemade alcohol. Sugar shortages worsened because people began buying sugar in bulk to ferment their own liquor. State revenues collapsed because alcohol sales had previously been a major source of income, and resentment toward the government grew because people felt treated like children. The campaign ended up damaging both the economy and Gorbachev's credibility. Meanwhile, Gorbachev's political reforms weakened the Communist Party's monopoly on power. Although he did not intend to dismantle the party, his reforms created new elected bodies, such as the Congress of People's Deputies. These institutions gave citizens and regional leaders a platform to criticize Moscow openly. It was like opening a valve on a pressure cooker. Once the steam escaped, closing it again was impossible. Televised sessions of the Congress became wildly popular. Millions of citizens watched politicians argue, expose corruption, demand accountability, and challenge decades-old dogmas. The very act of witnessing open political debate was revolutionary for a society accustomed to silence and unanimity. One of the rising figures in these televised debates was Boris Yeltsin. Once a supporter of Gorbachev, Yeltsin became a critic, arguing that reforms were too slow, too cautious, and too restricted by bureaucratic resistance. His passionate speeches resonated with an increasingly frustrated public. He positioned himself as the voice of ordinary Russians, someone willing to confront the entrenched elite. Yeltsin's ascent created a power struggle that would eventually determine the fate of the Soviet Union. The irony was that Gorbachev, by introducing political pluralism, inadvertently empowered the very forces that would weaken his position and decentralize authority away from the Kremlin. At the same time, nationalist movements gained momentum across the republics. In the Baltic states, for example, independence movements flourished openly. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had long viewed Soviet rule as occupation, and glasnost allowed them to revive suppressed histories and cultural identities. demonstrations swelled in size. Known as the Singing Revolution, these movements used music, mass gatherings, and peaceful protest to demand independence. One of the most symbolic events occurred in 1989, when nearly 2 million people joined hands across the three Baltic republics in a 600-kilometer human chain called the Baltic Way. The government in Moscow was stunned. This was not anti-Soviet agitation from a small fringe. It was a unified demand from entire nations. In the Caucasus, tensions took a more violent turn. Armenia and Azerbaijan clashed over the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, sparking ethnic conflict that the Central Soviet government struggled and failed to control. In Georgia, pro-independence rallies were met with brutal crackdowns, deepening mistrust. In Central Asia, long-suppressed ethnic grievances and economic imbalance led to riots, protests, and the rise of local nationalist movements. The Soviet Union had always been a multi-ethnic empire held together by authoritarian control. Once that control loosened, the centrifugal forces of nationalism tore at the fabric of the state. Economic decline intersected with these political and ethnic tensions in destructive ways. As shortages worsened, republics began hoarding resources for themselves instead of sending them to the central government. Local leaders realized that independence might offer more economic stability than remaining tied to a collapsing union. Without economic cohesion, political unity became nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the ideological foundation of the Soviet Union was disintegrating. Under glasnost, previously banned books, films, and political writings became available. Citizens read about the Gulag, the man-made famine in Ukraine during the 1930s, the suppression of dissent, the massacres, and the corruption. The myth that the Communist Party was the benevolent guardian of equality shattered. Once the population understood the scale of deception that had shaped their lives, faith in the system drained away. People who had devoted their lives to socialist ideals felt betrayed. Young people who might have carried the ideology forward instead embraced Western culture, music, fashion, movies, and capitalist values. A society without ideological conviction cannot defend an ideological state. On the international stage, Gorbachev was hailed as a hero for ending the Cold War. He withdrew Soviet troops from Afghanistan in 1989, ending a disastrous conflict that had cost thousands of lives and drained the economy. He accepted the fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe without military intervention, shocking hardliners in the Soviet military and KGB. They saw his restraint as capitulation. But Gorbachev believed that force would only intensify the crisis and isolate the Soviet Union globally. However, when East Germany opened its borders and the Berlin Wall fell, it symbolized not just the collapse of Soviet influence in Europe, but the collapse of the entire communist project. For millions across the USSR, watching images of East Germans climbing the wall was a moment of hope, but also disorientation. If the Eastern Bloc could crumble so quickly, what about the Union itself? Inside the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall had a profound psychological effect. Satellite states that had once been tightly controlled were now free. Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania all abandoned communism within a year. These dramatic transformations convinced many Soviet citizens that Moscow no longer had the power or the will to maintain its empire. And if the empire could fall, perhaps the Union could too. Leaders in the republics observed how Eastern Europe transitioned from communism to independence and democracy. They saw opportunities for themselves. Gorbachev's popularity soared abroad but declined at home. Citizens blamed him for shortages. Hardliners blamed him for weakening the state. Reformists blamed him for moving too slowly. He had alienated nearly everyone. His attempts to create a new, more democratic Soviet Union lacked support from both the public and the political elite. Meanwhile, alternative power centers emerged. Boris Yeltsin, after being elected chairman of the Russian parliament, positioned Russia, not the Soviet Union, as the primary vehicle for reform and sovereignty. This was a political earthquake. Russia was the largest republic, the core of the Union. If Russia asserted independence from the USSR structures, the entire Union would be structurally meaningless. By 1990, the Soviet Union was in a full-blown constitutional crisis. Several republics declared sovereignty, arguing that their laws superseded those of Moscow. The Congress of People's Deputies, once a symbol of reform, became paralyzed by infighting. Yeltsin resigned from the Communist Party and called on others to do the same. The party's authority crumbled. Gorbachev introduced the presidency of the Soviet Union, a new office intended to stabilize the state, and took the role himself. But political authority was shifting rapidly away from the center, and creating a new title could not reverse that. Throughout all of this, daily life grew harsher. Inflation soared, factories closed, workers went unpaid, strikes spread across industries, the ruble lost value. Soviet citizens, once accustomed to a world where prices barely changed and employment was guaranteed, now faced economic insecurity for the first time. This fear accelerated the loss of faith in the system. And as we trace these interconnected threads, this documentary aims to bring every layer of the story to the surface. If you appreciate this depth, stay connected for the continuation. It helps ensure more long-form historical explorations like this can be created. By the end of 1990, the Soviet Union existed in name, but its authority was corroded. The republics were negotiating among themselves rather than with Moscow. The Communist Party was losing members, legitimacy, and control. The economy was on the edge of collapse. Nationalist movements were growing. Political power was fragmented. The world had changed, and the Soviet Union no longer had the means or unity to adapt. The final chapter of its existence was rapidly approaching, even though many still hoped that the Union could be saved through negotiation and a new treaty. In the next chapter, we will move into 1991, the year everything comes to a head. The failed coup attempt, the rise of Yeltsin, the final unraveling of authority, and the moment the Soviet flag descended for the last time. It was a year of drama, desperation, and irreversible decisions, and understanding it requires stepping inside the minds of those who tried to preserve the old order and those who were ready to bring it down. The year 1991 began with a sense of exhaustion, as if the Soviet Union were a massive machine still running but rattling violently, its bolts coming loose, its gears grinding without oil. Citizens felt it, officials felt it, even those in the highest positions of power felt it. Newspapers openly questioned whether the country could survive. Television commentators discussed crises that would have been unthinkable to mention just a few years earlier. The illusion of stability had been shattered. And although many still hoped something might rescue the nation from the edge, the truth was that events had gained momentum that no one could fully control. As we move into the pivotal year of 1991, it's worth remembering that deep dives like this one take time and dedication. So feel free to stay with this long-form journey if you appreciate seeing history unfold at the pace it truly happened. At the start of the year, Gorbachev's position was increasingly precarious. He had pushed reforms too fast for conservatives and too slowly for liberals. The Communist Party was split between old guard figures who wanted to restore discipline and order and reformists who wanted to dismantle the party's authority entirely. Even within Gorbachev's own inner circle, loyalties were uncertain. He was trapped between factions who both believed he was undermining the country, but for opposite reasons. Economically, the Soviet Union was in its worst crisis since the Second World War. The rationing system expanded. Ordinary people saw prices rising faster than their wages. Barter became common. In some regions, workers were paid in goods rather than cash. The ruble was nearly worthless. Soviet factories that had once produced tanks and advanced weapon systems now struggled to produce basic consumer goods. The military-industrial complex remained powerful, but it was draining the civilian economy dry. The republics, emboldened by the chaos, continued asserting their sovereignty. Lithuania declared full independence in 1990, and although Moscow refused to recognize it, the declaration sent shockwaves through the Union. In January 1991, Gorbachev sent troops into Vilnius and Riga, resulting in violent clashes and civilian deaths. The images of tanks rolling through Baltic cities horrified the public. The crackdown was meant to reassert central authority, but it had the opposite effect. It united the Baltic nations even more firmly in their pursuit of independence and ignited outrage among liberal Russians who demanded an end to violence. These events further eroded the delicate political support Gorbachev still retained. Meanwhile, Boris Yeltsin was gaining power at an astonishing rate. In June 1991, he was elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the largest and most powerful of the 15 Soviet republics. This was a monumental shift. For the first time, Russia had its own elected leader, someone whose legitimacy came directly from the people rather than the Communist Party. Yeltsin became the face of the rising democratic movement, the champion of reform beyond Gorbachev's cautious approach. His victory made it clear that political authority was shifting rapidly away from the Soviet center and toward the individual republics. One of Gorbachev's last hopes for saving the Union was the New Union Treaty. This document aimed to transform the Soviet Union into a looser confederation, a collection of sovereign states unified in certain key areas such as defense, foreign policy, and economic cooperation. Several republics, including Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, were prepared to sign. The treaty represented the final attempt to modernize the Soviet system without tearing it apart. Ironically, it was also a treaty that the hardline conservatives saw as the ultimate betrayal. To them, the treaty meant the end of a united Soviet empire and the death of the communist project. These conservative officials included high-ranking members of the KGB, the military, and the Communist Party's old leadership. They had watched with growing alarm as Eastern Europe collapsed, as glasnost exposed previously unthinkable truths, and as national movements surged. They saw Yeltsin as a dangerous demagogue, Gorbachev as weak and misguided, and the reformists as traitors. For them, restoring order meant stopping the reforms at all costs. They genuinely believed the Soviet Union could still be saved if someone acted decisively, and so they planned to act. The stage was set for the most dramatic moment in the collapse, the August coup. By mid-August 1991, the new Union Treaty was scheduled to be signed within days. Once signed, power would shift permanently from the central government to the republics. For the conservatives, this was the point of no return. They believed that unless they intervened immediately, the Soviet Union as they knew it would dissolve forever. So a group calling itself the State Committee on the State of Emergency, composed of senior officials including Gorbachev's own vice president and the head of the KGB, prepared to seize control. On August 18, they made their move. While Gorbachev was vacationing at his dacha in Crimea, the coup plotters isolated him, cutting his phone lines, restricting his access, and demanding he sign a declaration of emergency. Gorbachev refused. Trapped and powerless, he could do nothing but wait as events unfolded. The coup leaders announced that Gorbachev was ill and unable to rule. They deployed tanks and troops into Moscow, intending to take control of the media, government buildings, and key infrastructure. But the coup plotters made several fatal miscalculations. They underestimated the public's readiness to resist. They underestimated Yeltsin's ability to rally opposition. And most importantly, they underestimated the degree to which glasnost had changed the mindset of the people. This was not the Soviet Union of the 1950s or even the 1970s. The fear that had once ensured compliance had eroded. People were no longer willing to accept authoritarian rule passively. On August 19, Yeltsin climbed atop a tank outside the Russian White House and addressed the crowd, calling the coup unconstitutional and urging citizens to defend democracy. The image of Yeltsin standing defiantly on that tank became one of the most iconic moments in modern Russian history. Hundreds of thousands of people responded. They erected barricades. They confronted soldiers. Muscovites who had never imagined themselves as revolutionaries stood in front of armored vehicles to block their advance. The coup leaders, for all their power, hesitated. They were unsure whether the military would fire on civilians. Some commanders refused outright. The coup plotters attempted to impose a curfew and control the media, but their messages were inconsistent and unconvincing. Yeltsin and the resistance broadcast their own messages, using whatever channels they could: fax machines, radio, even handwritten leaflets. It was a battle of voices as much as a battle of forces. After 3 days of paralysis, confusion, and growing resistance, the coup collapsed. The plotters were arrested or fled. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but the victory did not restore his authority. Instead, the failed coup fatally wounded the Soviet Union. It discredited the Communist Party entirely, showing its willingness to use force to retain power and its inability to succeed even in doing that. The republics accelerated their moves toward independence. Yeltsin emerged as a national hero and the undisputed leader of Russia. For ordinary Soviet citizens, the events of August were both terrifying and exhilarating. They saw tanks in the streets, but they also saw the people win. They saw leaders attempt to turn back the clock, but they also saw those leaders fail. It was a moment when history turned sharply, not because of calculation, but because of courage and chaos intertwining. And as we continue exploring these turning points, remember that supporting in-depth historical storytelling helps keep these detailed narratives possible. The more interest and engagement these stories receive, the more we can continue producing them in full, immersive length. After the coup, the Soviet Union unraveled with astonishing speed. In the months that followed, republic after republic declared independence. Even those that had hesitated earlier now saw no viable future within a collapsing state. Ukraine's declaration in August, followed by an overwhelming referendum in December approving independence, was particularly decisive. With Ukraine gone, the Union ceased to have the geographic and demographic foundation needed to exist in any meaningful form. Gorbachev attempted to salvage a smaller union, but it was too late. Yeltsin and other republic leaders formed the Commonwealth of Independent States in early December, effectively bypassing the Soviet government entirely. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, acknowledging that his country had ceased to exist. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin and replaced by the Russian tricolor. What had taken 70 years to build had vanished in less than a year. And in the next chapter, we will explore in depth why the collapse happened so quickly after the coup, what life was like in those final months, and how the political power struggle between Gorbachev and Yeltsin shaped the world we know today. When the August coup collapsed, the Soviet Union was left standing only in name, like an old building whose facade still stands but whose interior has already been gutted. Although the red flag still flew above the Kremlin, its meaning had changed. The Communist Party, once the unshakable pillar of political life, was now suspended, discredited, and rapidly losing whatever authority it had left. Citizens watched the coup's aftermath unfold with a mixture of relief, disbelief, and anticipation. They sensed that something irreversible had just happened, though few understood how fast the consequences would come. As we continue through this long, complex unraveling, keep in mind that deep historical projects like this rely on audiences who enjoy the slow, detailed excavation of the past. So feel free to stay with the journey as we move deeper into the months that ended one of history's largest empires. After the coup, Boris Yeltsin wasted no time. He issued decrees suspending the Communist Party's activities across Russia, seizing party property, taking control of the KGB under Russian authority, and redirecting the major ministries away from the Soviet government and toward the Russian Republic. This was not a revolution in the streets. It was a revolution in paperwork, signatures, and institutional loyalty. The enormous machinery of the state, which for decades had answered only to Moscow and the Politburo, now began shifting under Yeltsin's command. Soldiers, managers, bureaucrats, and regional leaders had to decide whom they would obey, the fading Soviet president or the newly empowered Russian one. Most chose Yeltsin. Meanwhile, Mikhail Gorbachev returned to his Kremlin office, but his authority had evaporated. He was a president without a state, a leader without loyal institutions, a figurehead without a functioning apparatus behind him. Even his closest advisors knew the Soviet system was dying. Gorbachev declared the coup illegal, denounced the conspirators, and attempted to restore calm, but the political center he depended on had already collapsed during the three-day crisis. The Republic sensed it. If the coup had succeeded, they might have been suppressed. But since it failed, the Republic saw their opportunity and moved swiftly. Ukraine, which had always been central to the Soviet identity and economy, proclaimed independence just days after the coup. Armenia, Moldova, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, and others followed. Even republics that had once been hesitant now questioned what the Soviet Union offered them. Why remain part of a failing union whose central government could no longer ensure basic stability, economic cohesion, or political legitimacy? The pace of disintegration in late 1991 is often described as a chain reaction, but that doesn't fully capture it. It was more like a dam cracking in multiple places simultaneously. Each declaration of independence weakened the pressure holding the others back. And once the flow began, it could not be stopped. For ordinary Soviet citizens, daily life grew increasingly surreal. Money was losing value. Store shelves were emptier than they had ever been. Newspapers announced independence declarations almost weekly. Government ministries changed names, jurisdictions, and allegiances. People did not know whether they were still Soviet citizens or now citizens of a republic or something in between. For decades, the Soviet system had been rigid and predictable. Now everything seemed to shift beneath their feet. Economic collapse accelerated the political collapse. In autumn 1991, production plummeted across most industrial sectors. The central planning system was barely functioning. Ministries gave orders that factories ignored. Regions hoarded supplies. Barter networks expanded. Inflation spiraled. Pensioners suffered terribly. The economy resembled a giant machine that had run without maintenance for too long and now broke down in real time. Many people blamed Gorbachev. Others blamed the coup plotters. Still others blamed the entire communist experiment. And as we navigate these final months, remember that supporting long-form work like this helps preserve deep historical documentary storytelling, stories that often fade beneath shorter, simplified narratives. By October, Gorbachev attempted one final push to save a renewed union. He proposed a new federal arrangement, one that would give the republics even more autonomy but preserve a central framework. The problem was that the republics no longer trusted the center at all. They had witnessed the failed coup, the military deployments, the crumbling institutions, and the paralysis of the Soviet parliament. Why sign up for another agreement with a government that could not guarantee stability or even its own survival? Yeltsin, meanwhile, recognized that the path to Russia's future lay not in saving the Soviet Union, but in building a new Russian state. He took control of the Russian armed forces, the Russian media, and the Russian economy. The Soviet institutions still existed, but they were hollow shells. Even the Kremlin guards were uncertain whom they technically served. All of this built toward the decisive moment in December. In early December 1991, Yeltsin met secretly with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus in a secluded hunting lodge in the Belavia forest. The meeting was designed to address economic coordination among the three Slavic republics, but Yeltsin had a larger goal. These leaders concluded that the Soviet Union was no longer viable. They drafted and signed the Belavia Accords, declaring that the USSR had ceased to exist and establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States (CIS) in its place. This was not just a political maneuver, it was a legal death certificate for the Soviet Union. When Gorbachev heard the news, he was stunned. He attempted to rally opposition, arguing that only a nationwide decision could dissolve the Union. But the reality was that the Russian parliament supported Yeltsin. The Ukrainian referendum on independence had passed with overwhelming approval. The Belavia Agreement reflected a political truth that had already taken shape. The Soviet state no longer had a foundation. In the days that followed, more republics joined the CIS or declared independence. The Soviet institutions, ministries, committees, agencies were either absorbed into Russian equivalents or simply shut down. Even Soviet military officers, lifelong servants of the Red Banner, watched as their units were reassigned to Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, or other emerging states. The final moment came on December 25, 1991. Gorbachev, after days of resisting the inevitable, went on television to deliver a short, somber resignation speech. He spoke plainly, acknowledging the forces that had torn the country apart and defending his attempts at reform. He emphasized that the Soviet Union had been his homeland and that he never intended to destroy it. Then he ended with a simple statement. He was resigning as president because the country that office represented no longer existed. That evening, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time and replaced by the tricolor of the Russian Federation. The world's map changed. Millions of people woke up the next morning in new countries without having moved an inch. The Cold War ended not with a violent revolution, but with a quiet, symbolic gesture, the lowering of a flag. And as we step away from that historic night, remember that the threads of this story reach far beyond 1991. The fall of the Soviet Union reshaped global politics, economics, identity, and conflict in ways still unfolding today. If this kind of deep, long-form historical exploration speaks to you, staying with the series ensures more stories like this reach the audience that values them. In the wake of the Soviet Union's formal dissolution, the world reacted with a mixture of astonishment and uncertainty. For decades, the USSR had been one of the two great pillars of global power, a superstate whose military and ideological presence shaped every region of the globe. Now, almost overnight, it was gone. Diplomats, economists, military leaders, and ordinary citizens struggled to comprehend the scale of the shift. Yet for the people inside the former Soviet republics, the reality was far more personal, far more chaotic, and far more immediate. Borders did not move, but everything else did. And as we continue through this detailed reconstruction of those chaotic final months, remember that long-form history like this exists because of people who truly enjoy going deep. So thank you for staying with this journey as we trace the human side of a geopolitical earthquake. With the Soviet flag lowered and the tricolor raised, Russia declared itself the legal successor state to the USSR. This meant inheriting not only the seat at the United Nations Security Council, but also the nuclear arsenal, the debts, the assets abroad, and the military structures. Yet Russia itself was unstable. The economy was in free fall, politics were turbulent, and social life was marked by confusion. Many Russians felt a strange mix of relief and loss. The Soviet Union had been their home, their identity, their place in the world. And now it was gone, not defeated by an enemy, not overthrown by a violent rebellion, but dissolved by political agreements and historical pressure. One of the most pressing issues in the immediate post-Soviet environment was the fate of nuclear weapons. The USSR had possessed the largest nuclear stockpile on Earth, with warheads stationed across multiple republics, including Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Suddenly, there were 4 nuclear-armed states with no cohesive command structure. The fear of nuclear material falling into the wrong hands, or of miscommunication leading to catastrophe, ran high across the world. Negotiations began quickly, with the United States, Russia, and the newly independent states working to secure and eventually dismantle many of these weapons. Yet at the time, the uncertainty felt dangerous. People were aware that history had entered uncharted territory. Economically, the situation was even more dire. By late 1991 and early 1992, inflation in Russia and other republics soared into the triple digits. Prices changed daily, sometimes hourly. Savings that citizens had accumulated over decades evaporated. Pensioners were among the hardest hit. They had no way to adapt to the chaos. Factories that once depended on central planning no longer knew whom to report to or where to send their products. Distribution networks that had been centrally organized collapsed. Many businesses shut down. Others turned to informal arrangements, trading goods through improvised barter systems. For decades, the Soviet economy had been rigid, inefficient, and insulated from market pressures. Now it was exposed abruptly to the raw forces of supply and demand, and millions of people were unprepared. Social changes swept across the former Soviet republics with equal speed. Under communism, while life had been highly controlled, it had also been structured. People had jobs guaranteed, education guaranteed, a predictable, if limited, path through life. Now there was freedom, but freedom without a safety net. Some embraced the new opportunities. Entrepreneurs appeared, importers brought Western goods into newly opened markets, and bold individuals entered politics or media. But for many others, the change was frightening. Crime rates rose sharply. Organized criminal groups expanded their reach. Corruption, long present beneath the surface, became more overt. The police and judiciary struggled to adapt to the new environment. Amid all this turmoil, debates erupted over how quickly and radically to reform the economy. In Russia, Yeltsin's government pursued a program known as shock therapy, rapid liberalization, privatization, and opening of markets. The idea was that a swift transition would prevent endless stagnation, yet the shock was deeply felt. Prices spiked, industries collapsed, and wealth became concentrated in the hands of a small group of businessmen who would later be known as the oligarchs. These men acquired factories, mines, oil fields, and other state assets at a fraction of their real value. Many ordinary Russians watched in disbelief as vast fortunes emerged seemingly overnight. But while we often focus on Russia's internal turmoil, the other newly independent republics faced equally complex challenges. In Ukraine, the struggle centered on building national institutions, balancing relations with Russia and the West, and stabilizing an economy that had been deeply integrated into Soviet structures. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, there was a rapid shift toward Western-style reforms, democratization, and integration with Europe. Their relative success in the early years was influenced by their smaller size, stronger national identities, and clear historical memory of independence before Soviet occupation. Central Asian republics confronted an entirely different landscape. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan each had their own political elites, cultural traditions, and economic foundations. Some embraced continuity with Soviet-era leadership, creating stable but authoritarian regimes. Others struggled with internal conflict and economic fragility. Tajikistan descended into civil war shortly after independence, a conflict that would last for years and devastate the country. In the Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia grappled with nationalism, territorial disputes, and political instability. The conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, already violent in the late Soviet years, intensified dramatically after independence. Georgia faced separatist movements in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, as well as internal political struggles that would destabilize the nation for much of the 1990s. These divergent experiences highlight the fact that the Soviet collapse was not a single story, but a constellation of 17 different ones, 15 republics, and two major political centers, Moscow and the Communist Party, each facing their own reckoning. Yet beneath all their differences, they shared one underlying reality: the sudden disappearance of the central authority that had defined every aspect of life for 70 years. Meanwhile, historians and political scientists tried to grapple with the magnitude of what had happened. Some argued that the collapse was inevitable, given the systemic contradictions of the Soviet model. Others saw it as a failure of leadership, blaming Gorbachev for loosening control too rapidly or blaming Yeltsin for undermining attempts at reform. Still others emphasized the role of long-term economic stagnation or the rise of national identity movements. In truth, no single explanation suffices. The Soviet collapse was like a structure built on multiple pillars. When each one weakened simultaneously, the entire building crumbled. Among the general population, memory of the Soviet Union became a topic of intense debate in the years that followed. Some remembered it with nostalgia, recalling the security, order, and sense of collective purpose they felt. Others remembered the shortages, the repression, and the lack of freedom. Both memories were true, shaped by individual experiences and by the profound contrast with the chaotic 1990s. Even today, the legacy of the Soviet Union continues to shape politics, identity, and geopolitical tensions across the region. The past did not simply disappear with the lowering of the flag. Yet as we tell this story, it's important to recognize the human element. Millions of families trying to make sense of a transformed world, adapting to new currencies, new governments, new borders, and new ways of life. These personal histories often receive less attention than the political dramas, but they form the real fabric of the post-Soviet transition. And if deep, human-centered explorations like this resonate with you, feel free to stay with this long documentary series. Your engagement genuinely helps keep long-form history alive. By early 1992, the dust had not settled, but the outlines of the new world were visible. Russia emerged as the dominant successor state, but the United States was now the unchallenged global superpower. Europe was reshaping itself, with former Soviet satellites seeking integration with Western institutions. China, watching quietly from the sidelines, took note of how a rigid communist system had collapsed under its own contradictions and would later adjust its own model to avoid similar pitfalls. The geopolitical map had been rewritten, and the ripples from the Soviet collapse would continue spreading outward for decades. In the next chapter, we will look deeper at the internal contradictions that had built up over decades, how economic stagnation, political rigidity, ideological decay, and ethnic tensions interacted long before 1991. Understanding these foundations will clarify why, when the crisis finally hit, the Soviet Union lacked the resilience to survive. To understand why the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed, it is not enough to look only at the dramatic final years or the sudden political battles between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. The roots of the collapse stretch far back into the structure of the system itself, into contradictions that had been present since the earliest decades of Soviet rule. These contradictions accumulated slowly, layer upon layer, like geological pressure building beneath the earth. By the late 1980s, the pressure could no longer be contained. The crisis that erupted was not caused by one mistake, one leader, or one moment. It was the result of decades of unresolved tension, economic, political, ideological, social, and national. And as we explore these deeper foundations, remember that long-form history like this survives because of people who genuinely appreciate detailed storytelling. So thank you for staying with this journey as we continue peeling back the layers of an empire's demise. Economically, the Soviet system was built on central planning, an ambitious model designed to eliminate the chaos of market capitalism. The state decided what factories would produce, how many workers they would employ, what quotas they must meet, and how output would be distributed. In theory, this meant perfect efficiency. No wasteful competition, no boom and bust cycles, no unemployment. In reality, it created a rigid, inflexible system that could not adapt to changing conditions. Ministries issued production targets without understanding local realities, and factories often produced goods that were technically on quota, but functionally useless. A factory that needed 10 tons of steel might receive 7, while another received too much. A plant that fell short of its quota could hide the shortfall by adjusting the paperwork, and managers became experts at manipulating statistics to satisfy distant bureaucrats. Over time, this led to what many economists called the culture of lying. Everyone knew that the numbers reported to Moscow were embellished or fabricated, yet the system encouraged it. Success was measured by meeting quotas, not by creating useful products. This created a massive gap between the official image of Soviet success and the reality experienced by ordinary citizens, who often found themselves standing in lines for basic goods. The Brezhnev era, which many Soviet citizens nostalgically remembered for stability, was actually a period when these inefficiencies hardened. The state continued extracting raw materials, expanding heavy industry, and subsidizing vast military production, while civilian needs were systematically neglected. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union was importing grain just to feed its population, an embarrassing sign of agricultural failure for a country spanning 11 time zones. The ideological contradiction was just as profound. Marxist-Leninist ideology promised a future of abundance, equality, and classless harmony. But by the 1970s and 1980s, the gap between ideological promises and lived reality was too large to ignore. The ruling elite enjoyed privileges ordinary people could never dream of: special stores, better apartments, priority medical care, vacation homes, and connections that allowed them to bypass the shortages that defined everyone else's life. Even though propaganda insisted that socialism had created a society free of exploitation, people could clearly see that a new ruling class existed. This contradiction eroded belief in the system from within. When Gorbachev introduced glasnost, allowing public discussion of past crimes and present failures, decades of suppressed skepticism and anger burst into the open. The political system was another source of structural weakness. The Soviet Union was theoretically a federation of equal republics, but in practice, Moscow dominated everything. Local autonomy was limited, ethnic identities were suppressed, and political dissent was not tolerated. For decades, nationalist sentiments simmered beneath the surface. In the Baltic states, people preserved their languages and cultures despite Sovietization policies. In the Caucasus, ancient identities refused to disappear. In Central Asia, Soviet authority often felt imposed from afar. The communist leadership assumed that economic modernization and decades of centralized control would create a single Soviet identity, but this never happened. The moment glasnost allowed open expression, nationalist movements surged across the republics. What surprised Moscow was not that nationalism existed, but how widespread and deeply rooted it was. The military burden further strained the system. Maintaining superpower status required vast spending on weapons, research, and global influence. The arms race with the United States consumed a huge share of the Soviet budget. Some estimates placed military spending at up to 25–30% of GDP, far higher than the US military share. This forced the government to neglect consumer goods, infrastructure, and technological innovation. The Soviet Union was full of brilliant scientists, But rigid institutional structures prevented the rapid development of technologies like personal computers, telecommunications, and high-value manufacturing. While the West underwent the digital revolution, the USSR remained trapped in an industrial model from the mid-20th century. Another long-term problem was the demographic and social crisis that slowly emerged. Alcoholism was widespread, reducing productivity and lowering life expectancy among men. Birth rates varied sharply across republics, creating tensions about political representation and resource distribution. The health care system, once considered a point of Soviet pride, deteriorated, leading to rising mortality rates. All of these problems, ignored for decades, created a society increasingly unable to sustain itself. Corruption and stagnation were inseparable companions of the late Soviet period. The ruling elite, often referred to informally as the nomenklatura, controlled access to virtually every important position in the economy, government, and society. Promotion depended not on performance, but on loyalty. Innovation, risk-taking, and criticism were discouraged. This rewarded mediocrity and punished talent. When Gorbachev tried to reorganize this rigid system, the bureaucracy resisted fiercely. Many officials sabotaged reforms, fearing loss of privilege. The system was too entrenched to reform from the inside, yet too brittle to withstand shock from the outside. This paradox was one of the central reasons perestroika failed. Partial reform destabilized the system instead of revitalizing it. Energy dependency created another layer of fragility. During the 1970s oil boom, high global oil prices masked deeper weaknesses. Oil and gas exports provided the USSR with hard currency, allowing it to import grain, machines, and consumer goods. But in the 1980s, global oil prices fell sharply. This deprived the Soviet Union of critical revenue at a time when its economic weaknesses were becoming harder to hide. A system that had depended on resource extraction for survival suddenly had to confront its lack of diversification. The drop in oil prices hit the economy like a silent earthquake, slow, deep, and destructive. Another structural fault line lay in the relationship between the center and the republics. The Soviet Union was formally based on the idea that republics voluntarily joined the Union and could leave if they chose. In practice, leaving was unthinkable. But once Glasnost allowed open discussion, the republics realized they had legal and political grounds to assert their independence. Moscow, already weakened, could not stop them. This created a cascade effect. As one republic moved towards sovereignty, others followed. The center tried to negotiate a new union treaty, but by then it was too late. The republics had tasted autonomy and were unwilling to return to the old hierarchy. The Soviet system also suffered from a technological gap that grew wider over time. By the 1980s, global economic leadership depended on computers, microelectronics, telecommunications, and service industries. These technologies demanded flexibility, creativity, and decentralized decision-making, qualities fundamentally incompatible with Soviet central planning. The West raced ahead, powered by innovation and the information economy. The Soviet Union remained anchored to heavy industry, unable to pivot. When Gorbachev tried to introduce limited market reforms, they collided with the rigid old structures, producing confusion instead of progress. Yet perhaps the most profound long-term contradiction was psychological. For decades, the Soviet people lived under a system that demanded conformity, punished initiative, and discouraged personal ambition. Many grew accustomed to a passive relationship with the state, expecting security in exchange for obedience. But when the system began to falter, people were thrust into an environment that demanded self-motivation, adaptation, and risk-taking. This created immense stress and uncertainty. Some adapted quickly, others did not. Many felt betrayed by a state that had promised stability but delivered turmoil. These psychological fractures shaped political attitudes long after the collapse. When all of these contradictions converged in the 1980s, economic stagnation, ideological decay, political rigidity, national tensions, and global competition, the Soviet Union found itself in a position from which no single reform could save it. Gorbachev attempted to fix the system through openness and restructuring, but these exposed the underlying rot instead of healing it. Once citizens were allowed to see and speak the truth, the myth of the system's legitimacy evaporated. Understanding these deeper forces makes the final collapse in 1991 easier to comprehend. The Soviet Union did not fall because of one mistake or one leader. It fell because decades of accumulated contradictions finally exploded when the political center weakened. What appeared to be sudden was actually the result of long, slow erosion. In the next chapter, we will examine the human perspective of the collapse, how families, workers, soldiers, teachers, and young people experience the transition, and how their personal stories shape the memory of the Soviet Union even today. And if detailed explorations like this are the kind of content you'd want to support in documentary form, staying with the series helps ensure more can be created at this depth. For many historians, political scientists, and analysts, the fall of the Soviet Union is often narrated through the actions of leaders, the decisions of high officials, the signing of treaties, and the crumbling of institutions. But the true meaning of the collapse cannot be understood without looking at the lives of ordinary people who lived through it. Workers who suddenly found their factories silent, soldiers unsure which flag they now served, teachers whose curriculum changed almost overnight, and families who woke up in new countries without ever crossing a border. The collapse was not only a geopolitical upheaval, but a deeply personal experience, and its impact varied across generations, professions, and regions. As we explore these perspectives, remember that long-form, human-centered storytelling like this thrives on the support of people who enjoy digging into the past with patience and depth. So thank you for staying with this journey. For an entire generation raised during the post-war decades, life in the Soviet Union had a predictable rhythm. Children entered the young pioneers, later the Komsomol, and adults found work through state assignments. Promotions were steady, careers were lifelong. Housing was distributed according to need and seniority. Apartments may have been small and often shared, but they were guaranteed. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the sudden absence of structure left many people adrift. A factory worker in Moscow, who had spent 20 years assembling machine parts, now found himself unsure if he would receive a paycheck. A miner in Donetsk, who once took pride in fulfilling production quotas, suddenly faced unpaid wages and unsafe conditions as state subsidies evaporated. The psychological shock was enormous. Many struggled to adapt to a world that demanded entrepreneurial instincts they had never been allowed to develop. Elderly citizens were among the most vulnerable. Their pensions, once stable, became worthless in the face of hyperinflation. Prices skyrocketed and savings disappeared. Some pensioners turned to selling small items on street corners, old books, tools, homemade snacks, anything to supplement their meager income. In Leningrad, later renamed St. Petersburg, elderly women could be seen standing in freezing weather outside metro stations, offering jars of pickles or knitted socks for a few rubles. These were people who had survived wars, famines, evacuations, and Stalinist repression. Yet the economic chaos of the 1990s tested them in new and unexpected ways. For young people, the collapse was both frightening and exciting. University students who had grown up under a system that emphasized ideological loyalty now found themselves facing a world filled with new cultural influences. Western movies, music, fashion, and technology flooded into the former Soviet republics. Jeans, once scarce and expensive, became widely available. Advertisements, previously rare, filled city streets and television screens. Nightlife bloomed in cities like Moscow, Riga, and Kiev. Some young people embraced these changes with enthusiasm, seeing them as liberation from the monotony of Soviet life. Others struggled with identity. What did it mean to be Russian, Ukrainian, Kazakh, Georgian, or Latvian in a post-Soviet world? Teachers faced unique challenges. The school curriculum had been built around Soviet ideology, Soviet history, Marxist-Leninist philosophy, and patriotic education. After the collapse, much of this content became obsolete overnight. Teachers were told to adopt new textbooks, yet new textbooks often arrived late or were incomplete. Many educators had devoted their careers to teaching an ideological narrative they no longer believed in. They had to rebuild their understanding of history while simultaneously guiding a generation of students through uncertainty. In Ukraine and the Baltic states, teachers suddenly emphasized national history that had been suppressed for decades. In Russia, history education became a battleground of identity, with debates over how to portray the Soviet past. Soldiers experienced an even more dramatic transformation. The Soviet military had once been one of the most powerful in the world, with millions of personnel, cutting-edge weapons, and a vast global presence. Now soldiers found themselves reassigned to new national armies depending on where they were stationed. A soldier serving in Latvia or Azerbaijan might suddenly be told he now belonged to the armed forces of a newly independent country. Others faced the opposite dilemma. They wanted to return to their home republic, but transportation, housing, and documentation were chaotic. Some units were disbanded entirely. Military families had relied on Soviet support systems, but after the collapse, many bases struggled to provide even basic necessities. In rural areas, the collapse affected people differently. In parts of Central Asia, village life continued with little change at first. Traditions and local structures had always been more influential than distant Moscow. But as supply chains collapsed and subsidies disappeared, farmers faced shortages of fuel, fertilizer, and machinery. Kolkhozes and sovkhozes, the collective and state farms, had been central to rural life. Their dissolution created confusion about land ownership, responsibility, and rights. In some regions, privatization worked smoothly. In others, it led to corruption and exploitation as local elites seized the best farmland. Ethnic identity also played a critical role in shaping how people experienced the collapse. In the Baltic states, many ethnic Russians faced uncertain legal status. Some had lived there for generations, but were now seen by Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanian authorities as immigrants. They had to apply for residency or citizenship, often facing language requirements. Meanwhile, in Russia, millions of ethnic Russians who had lived as minorities in other republics suddenly became foreigners in places they had considered home. This created emotional dilemmas. Should they remain or return to Russia, a country they might not have lived in for decades? In the Caucasus, ethnic tensions escalated rapidly. Armenians and Azerbaijanis clashed over Nagorno-Karabakh, leading to violence, displacement, and the emergence of separatist movements. Georgia struggled with separatist conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The collapse of Soviet authority removed the external pressure that had kept these tensions frozen. Once the pressure was gone, conflict erupted. Crime became a defining feature of the early post-Soviet years. Under the Soviet system, crime had existed, often more than official statistics admitted, but it had been controlled by strong policing and authoritarian oversight. After the collapse, law enforcement was underfunded, disorganized, and politically uncertain. Criminal groups, some of which had roots in Soviet-era prison networks, expanded rapidly. They took over black market operations, protection rackets, and privatization auctions. In Russia, this period became known as the Wild 90s, a time when assassinations, gang wars, and corruption were common. Ordinary citizens were caught in the middle, navigating a society with new dangers and fewer protections. But it would be wrong to view the collapse only through a lens of suffering. Many people experienced newfound freedoms that were genuinely meaningful. Entrepreneurs opened cafes, shops, and small businesses. Writers could publish books that had been banned for decades. Journalists investigated corruption without fear of censorship, at least in the early 1990s. Religious communities revived traditions that had been suppressed under communism. Families who had been unable to travel freely could now visit relatives abroad. The world opened up, and for many, that openness was exhilarating. Students who grew up in the 1990s later described it as a time of possibility, chaotic, unstable, but full of opportunities that their parents could never have imagined. Some of the most successful businesses and cultural movements of the post-Soviet era began in this period. In the Baltic states, for example, the rapid adoption of technology led to the rise of digital economies. In Ukraine, a vibrant cultural scene emerged in cities like Lviv and Kiev. In Russia, filmmakers, musicians, and artists explored themes that had been taboo for generations. The memory of the collapse varies sharply depending on who you ask. For some, the Soviet Union represents a lost era of stability, predictability, and collective identity. For others, it represents repression, stagnation, and lost potential. Younger generations, who did not experience the USSR firsthand, often view it through stories told by their parents or through the lens of political narratives shaped by their countries. Memory is selective, emotional, and political, and the memory of the Soviet Union is no exception. As we shift toward the conclusion of this documentary's deeper analysis, it is important to remember that the collapse of the Soviet Union was not simply the end of a state. It was the end of an entire worldview. The people who lived through it carried those experiences forward, shaping the politics, culture, and identities of the post-Soviet world. And if journeys into the human dimensions of history like this are the type of content you want to keep seeing, staying engaged with this series helps ensure more stories can be told at this level. In the next chapter, we will zoom out and examine the geopolitical consequences of the collapse, how the world changed, how new conflicts were born, how old alliances shifted, and how the post-Cold War order emerged from the ruins of the Soviet Empire. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the geopolitical landscape of the world changed more dramatically and more suddenly than at any point since the end of the Second World War. For nearly half a century, the Cold War had defined the global order. Every major political decision, every regional conflict, every diplomatic negotiation had unfolded within the shadow of competition between the United States and the USSR. Now, one of those giants had vanished. The world entered a new era, one filled with opportunities, but also uncertainties, new ambitions, and new dangers. To fully understand the impact of this transformation, we must explore not only the actions of states, but also the underlying shifts in ideology, security, economics, and identity that rippled across continents. And as we go deeper into this global chapter of the story, thank you for staying with this long-form narrative. Support from people who enjoy deep documentaries like this is what allows projects of this scope to exist. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse, the United States emerged as the sole remaining superpower. This was not simply a symbolic status. It meant that American influence now extended in ways previously constrained by Soviet resistance. International institutions such as NATO, the European Union, the IMF, and the World Bank all expanded their roles. Without the ideological rivalry of communism versus capitalism, many countries that had balanced between the two shifted decisively toward Western systems. Economically, the 1990s became a decade of globalization, market liberalization, and the spread of Western technology and investment. Politically, the idea of liberal democracy gained dominance, with many believing that humanity had reached a permanent turning point. Some even declared the end of history, arguing that liberal capitalism had triumphed as the final form of human government. But this triumphalism masked deeper tensions beneath the surface, tensions that would grow in the following decades. Russia, inheriting the Soviet Union's seat at the UN Security Council and much of its military and diplomatic presence, struggled to find its place in this new order. The collapse of the USSR had not only reduced Russia's influence, it had shrunk its borders, population, and economic capacity. Suddenly, a country that had once controlled half of Europe found itself grappling with domestic chaos, economic decline, and political fragmentation. This produced a sense of humiliation and loss among many Russians, a feeling that the world often overlooked in the rush to embrace a post-Soviet future. One of the most immediate geopolitical changes was the expansion of NATO eastward. Countries that had once been part of the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and later others, sought membership in NATO to secure themselves against potential future Russian aggression. From their perspective, joining NATO was a logical step. The Soviet collapse had created a power vacuum, and aligning with the West offered stability. But in Russia, NATO expansion was seen very differently. Many Russians viewed it as a broken promise, believing that Western leaders had agreed during the negotiations around German reunification not to expand NATO 1 inch eastward. While historians still debate the exact terms of those early discussions, the interpretation inside Russia was clear. NATO advance was seen as a betrayal. This sense of betrayal would shape Russian politics for decades. It fueled nationalist sentiments, strengthened hardline groups, and contributed to a narrative that the West had exploited Russia's moment of weakness. This narrative later became a central theme in the political rise of Vladimir Putin, who promised to restore Russian stability, pride, and influence after the chaotic 1990s. Meanwhile, the newly independent states of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union faced their own geopolitical dilemmas. The Baltic states moved decisively toward European integration, embracing democratic reforms, economic liberalization, and Western security structures. Their small size and strong national identities helped them navigate the transition rapidly. Central Europe followed a similar path, eventually joining both NATO and the EU. For these countries, the collapse of the Soviet Union represented liberation and the restoration of sovereignty. Ukraine and Belarus, however, found themselves in a more complicated position. Ukraine was deeply divided, culturally, linguistically, economically, between its western regions, which leaned toward Europe, and its eastern regions, which had strong ties to Russia. This internal divide would shape Ukraine's politics for decades, and eventually play a central role in conflicts long after the Soviet collapse. Belarus, under the leadership of Alexander Lukashenko, took a different path, maintaining closer ties with Russia and preserving many Soviet-style economic structures. In the Caucasus, geopolitical turbulence intensified. Armenia and Azerbaijan entered a protracted conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, a conflict rooted in decades of Soviet policy and the ethnic map drawn under Stalin. Georgia struggled with separatist movements in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Russia, seeing an opportunity to maintain influence in the region, intervened politically and militarily, establishing a role as a mediator, but also as a power broker. These conflicts would shape regional politics for decades, creating frozen fronts and unresolved tensions. Central Asia, rich in natural resources and strategically located, became a region of intense geopolitical interest. Kazakhstan emerged as a regional leader, balancing relations between Russia, China, and the West. Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan pursued more authoritarian models. Kyrgyzstan experimented with democracy but faced internal instability. Tajikistan descended into a brutal civil war. For these countries, the collapse of the USSR meant not only independence, but also the challenge of building entirely new states, new armies, new currencies, new identities. Global powers took note. China began expanding its influence in Central Asia, recognizing the strategic importance of the region. China, in fact, learned one of the most important geopolitical lessons from the Soviet collapse. Chinese leaders studied the Soviet experience carefully, concluding that rapid political reform without economic stability would destroy a one-party system. The Chinese Communist Party used the Soviet collapse as a cautionary example, a justification for maintaining strict political control while pursuing market-based economic reforms. This decision would shape China's rise in the decades to come. On a global scale, the absence of the Soviet counterweight allowed the United States to engage more actively in regions previously off-limits or too risky. The Gulf War in 1991 demonstrated the new imbalance. The US led a broad coalition to repel Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, facing no ideological opposition from Moscow. Later interventions in the Balkans, the Middle East, and other regions reflected a world with a single dominant power. Yet this dominance did not guarantee stability. In many cases, the lack of a geopolitical counterweight created new dynamics that were unpredictable. The international economic system also transformed. Former Soviet republics entered global markets, often in chaotic ways. Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan became major exporters of oil, gas, and minerals. The Baltics became logistical and technological hubs. Economic partnerships shifted dramatically, with Western corporations investing heavily in newly opened markets. But this economic openness also led to exploitation, corruption, and the rise of powerful business elites who manipulated privatization to accumulate enormous wealth. These oligarchs would become central figures in the politics of their respective countries. Culturally, the collapse accelerated the global spread of Western ideas and media. Russian films, Ukrainian literature, Baltic art, all began interacting with global cultural movements in new ways. The global village that theorists had predicted became a reality. At the same time, nationalist movements revived suppressed traditions and languages. The collapse was not merely the end of Soviet identity. It was the rebirth of dozens of national identities and cultural frameworks that had been forced underground. Yet perhaps the most profound geopolitical change was psychological. For decades, the world had perceived global politics as a struggle between two ideological giants. With one gone, the world had to redefine itself. Some nations embraced the new order with confidence. Others experienced anxiety, fearing the instability that might follow. And in Russia, a deep identity crisis began to unfold, a crisis that would shape its political trajectory, foreign policy, and relationship with the world for decades to come. This chapter has taken us around the world, from Europe to Asia to global institutions, showing how the collapse of the Soviet Union reshaped nearly every aspect of international relations. But in the next chapter, we will return to the internal experience of Russia itself, how the country rebuilt, how it redefined its identity, and how the legacy of the Soviet collapse continues to influence Russian politics, society, and global behavior to this day. And if you enjoy long-form history presented at this level of depth, staying engaged with the series helps ensure more stories like this can be created. In the years immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia entered a period of confusion, improvisation, and reinvention. The country had inherited the Soviet Union's largest portion, its capital, its military, its diplomatic structures, and its nuclear arsenal, but it had not inherited a clear path forward. Russia's leaders, intellectuals, and citizens struggled with a question no one had been able to ask for 70 years. What should Russia be? A democracy? A continuation of Soviet structures under a new name? A hybrid of old and new? Or something entirely different? The answer to that question unfolded painfully over the course of the 1990s, shaping the world we live in today. As we explore Russia's turbulent rebirth, thank you for staying with this long documentary. Support from people who truly enjoy deep historical narratives makes projects like this possible, and your presence here keeps the story alive. The early 1990s in Russia were dominated by what many call the transition, though that word fails to capture the chaos and uncertainty of the time. President Boris Yeltsin, eager to break with Soviet economic stagnation, embraced what economists advised as a rapid shift toward a free market. This approach became known as shock therapy. The idea was simple: free prices, privatize industries, cut state subsidies, and let the market correct decades of distortion. But the execution was far from smooth. Prices soared overnight. Inflation reached thousands of percent. Wages lagged behind. Savings evaporated. Many Russians who had never experienced poverty suddenly faced it. Shops that had once been empty now filled with goods, but the prices were so high that ordinary citizens could barely afford them. Food markets, which had been predictable under the Soviet rationing system, now fluctuated wildly. A salary that could buy several kilograms of meat one week could barely buy bread the next. Hyperinflation eroded confidence in the government and the currency. People turned to bartering, using cigarettes, sugar, or even household appliances as forms of exchange. Pensioners were particularly devastated. Their fixed incomes could not keep up with the spiraling cost of living. At the same time, privatization reshaped the landscape of ownership in Russia. Factories, oil fields, mines, and state-owned enterprises were put up for sale. Rather than being distributed fairly among the population, these assets fell into the hands of a small group of businessmen who became the oligarchs. They used connections, insider information, and rapid financial maneuvers to acquire enormous wealth. For many ordinary Russians, privatization felt like theft. Public wealth accumulated over generations suddenly became private property controlled by a few. This perception contributed to widespread cynicism toward democratic reforms. The political system also struggled. Russia adopted a new constitution in 1993, but the process was anything but peaceful. That year, tensions between Yeltsin and the parliament erupted into a violent confrontation. The parliament, filled with former Soviet officials and nationalists, resisted Yeltsin's reforms. Yeltsin, determined to push forward, issued decrees dissolving the parliament. The deputies barricaded themselves in the White House, claiming Yeltsin was carrying out a coup. What followed was the most dramatic constitutional crisis in post-Soviet Russia. Armed supporters of the parliament clashed with police. The standoff escalated until Yeltsin ordered tanks to shell the White House. The images of smoke rising over central Moscow shocked the world. Dozens were killed. The crisis ended with Yeltsin's victory, but it left deep scars on Russian politics. It signaled that the new Russia, despite embracing democratic rhetoric, was not immune to the use of force in resolving political disputes. Many Russians saw the events of 1993 as a moment when democracy faltered before it had even taken root. Meanwhile, the social fabric of the country was changing as rapidly as the political landscape. For the first time in decades, Russians were free to travel abroad, start private businesses, publish independent newspapers, and express opinions openly. This cultural explosion transformed cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg into vibrant centers of creativity and commerce. Western books, films, music, and fashion poured in. Advertising became pervasive. Fast food chains appeared. Western-style shopping malls began to replace Soviet-era department stores. For younger Russians, this was an exhilarating period. For older generations, it was disorienting. Everything familiar seemed to be disappearing. Crime surged. Without a strong state to enforce order, criminal groups filled the vacuum. They took over businesses, engaged in contract killings, extorted money, and fought turf wars. Many of these groups emerged from the shadows of the Soviet prison system or the black market networks that had existed for decades. The 1990s became associated with gang violence, car bombings, and corruption at every level of government. ordinary people felt vulnerable. Police were underpaid and often complicit. Trust in institutions eroded further. Foreign policy during this period reflected Russia's weakened condition. Yeltsin sought cooperation with the West, hoping that integration with global markets and Western institutions would stabilize Russia's economy. The United States and European countries provided financial aid, but this aid often came with conditions that many Russians felt undermined their sovereignty. NATO expansion into Eastern Europe deepened resentment, creating a sense of encirclement. While the West celebrated the end of the Cold War, many Russians felt sidelined in the New World Order. This emotional and political disconnect would play an enormous role in shaping Russian politics later. Amid this turbulence, the conflict in Chechnya erupted. Chechnya, a republic within the Russian Federation, declared independence in 1991. Yeltsin refused to accept secession and launched a military operation in 1994. The war was brutal. Russian forces faced fierce resistance from Chechen fighters. Cities were devastated, especially the capital, Grozny. Civilians suffered immensely. The war exposed the weakness of the Russian military and deepened domestic discontent. Eventually, Russia withdrew in 1996, effectively conceding victory to Chechen separatists. But the conflict did not end. It would flare again later, shaping Russia's internal politics for years to come. By the late 1990s, Russia was exhausted. The economy, though showing signs of stabilization, suffered another crisis in 1998, when the government defaulted on its debts and the ruble collapsed again. Confidence in Yeltsin declined sharply. His health was deteriorating and his political influence waned. Many Russians believed the promises of the early 1990s, democracy, prosperity, integration with the world, had not been fulfilled. Instead, they experienced insecurity, inequality, corruption, and war. This sense of disappointment set the stage for a dramatic shift in leadership. On December 31, 1999, Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned. In a televised address, he apologized to the Russian people for not achieving all he had hoped. He announced that the new acting president would be Vladimir Putin, a relatively unknown former KGB officer who had risen rapidly through political ranks. Putin came to power promising stability, order, and the restoration of Russian pride. Many Russians, weary of chaos, embraced his message. Putin moved quickly to centralize authority, weaken the power of oligarchs, and reassert state control. He launched the Second Chechen War, this time with far greater force, and brought the region back under Russian control. He strengthened the security services, restricted political opposition, and regained influence over national television. His leadership marked a new phase in post-Soviet Russia, one that sought to rebuild state power and restore Russia's presence on the world stage. What followed in the 2000s and beyond was a gradual reassertion of Russian influence, both domestically and internationally. Economic growth returned, fueled by high oil and gas prices. Living standards improved for many. National confidence rose. But political freedoms narrowed, independent media declined, and opposition figures faced growing pressure. The dual legacy of the Soviet collapse, freedom mixed with instability, opportunity mixed with trauma, continued to shape Russian identity. The memory of the Soviet Union itself evolved over time. For some Russians, the USSR came to represent a lost era of stability and national dignity. For others, it symbolized authoritarianism and stagnation. Putin's government selectively revived Soviet imagery and narratives, emphasizing achievements such as victory in World War II, while downplaying or reinterpreting the darker chapters of Soviet history. This approach fostered a sense of continuity that helped consolidate national identity, but also influenced how the collapse was understood across generations. As we assess this long arc, from the collapse to Russia's attempts at reinvention, it becomes clear that the fall of the Soviet Union was not simply an event, but a process, one that continues to shape the world. The political tensions, cultural shifts, and economic transformations that emerged from the collapse reverberate into the present, influencing global geopolitics, identity debates, and conflicts across Eastern Europe and beyond. And if you appreciate exploring history in this deep, interconnected way, staying engaged with the series ensures more long-form narratives like this can be created. In the final chapter, we will draw together all the threads of the story, examining not only why the Soviet Union fell, but why its legacy remains so powerful, how the collapse transformed global history, and what lessons the world continues to learn from it. As we reach the end of this long journey through the life and death of the Soviet Union, it becomes clear that no single explanation, economic weakness, political mismanagement, ideological decay, or nationalist awakening, can fully capture why the USSR collapsed. The truth lies in the complex convergence of all these forces, interacting over decades, shaping and reshaping each other until the entire structure became unsustainable. The Soviet Union's fall was not a sudden catastrophe, but the final chapter of a long, slow unraveling. And as we bring this documentary to a close, thank you for staying through this entire deep dive. Support for these long-form explorations helps keep detailed historical storytelling alive, and it's always appreciated by those who create and those who listen. When the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist on December 25, 1991, people watching around the world believed they were witnessing a definitive end, an event that settled ideological debates, ended the Cold War, and established a new global order. But history is not neat, and the end of the USSR did not close a chapter as cleanly as many imagined. Instead, it began a new era, one filled with unresolved tensions, emerging identities, and shifting political dynamics that continue to shape the world to this day. The collapse revealed the limits of authoritarian modernization. For decades, Soviet leaders believed that a centralized state could engineer a perfect society through planning, discipline, and ideological unity. But the system they built suppressed creativity, discouraged innovation, and punished dissent. When the global economy evolved, the Soviet model could not evolve with it. When ideological confidence faltered, the system lacked the flexibility to adapt. The USSR showed that a state can accumulate power and build vast institutions, but without openness, competition, and the free exchange of ideas, stagnation becomes inevitable. At the same time, the collapse highlighted the power of nationalism and historical memory. Despite decades of Soviet propaganda, people never forgot who they were. The Estonians, Georgians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Armenians, Latvians, and others preserved identities older than the Soviet Union itself. Once glasnost allowed open discussion, these identities re-emerged with force. The USSR had tried to forge a common Soviet identity, but it was built on top of nations with deep roots. When the center weakened, the republics naturally drifted back to their own histories. Another lesson from the collapse concerns political legitimacy. For most of the Soviet period, the Communist Party claimed legitimacy through ideology and performance, through the promise of a better future and the reality of industrial growth. But when the economy weakened, when standards of living declined, and when people learned about Stalin's crimes and systemic corruption, the party's legitimacy evaporated. A government cannot rule indefinitely once people stop believing in the narrative that sustains it. The end of the USSR also revealed how fragile empires can be. For all its power, the Soviet Union depended on cohesion at the center. Once the top cracked open, and once the idea of the Union as an eternal, unbreakable entity was questioned, its entire foundation crumbled quickly. This is why empires often appear stable until the moment they collapse. The internal pressures build quietly, invisibly, and then suddenly burst into view. Perhaps the most striking lesson is that change that seems impossible can arrive faster than anyone expects. For decades, the idea that the Soviet Union could fall was unthinkable. Even intelligence analysts in major world powers routinely predicted that the system would endure, perhaps with reforms, for many more decades. Instead, it vanished in a matter of months. This unpredictability is a humbling reminder that history does not move in straight lines. Societies are complex, and when multiple crises converge, they can transform rapidly. Yet the collapse did not erase the Soviet legacy. Instead, it reshaped it. The Soviet past continues to influence the politics of Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic states, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. It shapes tensions over borders, languages, and security. Russia's attempts to reassert influence in the post-Soviet space, conflicts in Georgia and Ukraine, debates about NATO expansion, and struggles over historical memory all have roots in the unresolved legacies of the USSR's fall. Inside Russia, the memory of the Soviet Union remains contested. To some, the USSR represents a time when the country was respected, feared, and stable. To others, it represents repression, stagnation, and wasted potential. The government's approach to Soviet history reflects this tension, embracing certain aspects: industrial achievement, scientific triumphs, wartime heroism, while minimizing or reframing others, political repression, censorship, and economic failure. The narrative is carefully curated to strengthen contemporary political identity. Outside Russia, the Soviet legacy also shapes perceptions. In Eastern Europe, the memory of Soviet domination fuels suspicion and wariness toward Russian intentions. In Central Asia, the Soviet period is remembered both for modernization and for cultural suppression. In the West, the USSR remains a symbol of ideological confrontation, nuclear tension, and authoritarian governance. These layered memories influence diplomacy, culture, and global politics. The collapse of the Soviet Union also contributed to the rise of a globalized world. With one superpower gone, markets opened, technology spread, and new alliances formed. Yet this globalized world also created new inequalities and tensions, many of which can be traced back to the abrupt nature of the Soviet collapse and the unevenness of the post-Soviet transition. As we reflect on this long and transformative story, it becomes clear that the fall of the Soviet Union was not merely the end of a state, it was the beginning of a new era. It reshaped borders, economies, identities, and geopolitical realities. It created new nations and dissolved an empire. It offered hope for democracy and fear of instability. It produced opportunities and hardships. Its consequences continue to ripple outward, influencing global events decades later. This is why studying the Soviet collapse remains so important. It offers lessons about how societies change, how political systems rise and fall, how identity persists, and how global power shifts. It reminds us that history is not static, that even the largest and most formidable structures can crumble under the weight of internal contradictions, and that the future is always shaped by the decisions, mistakes, and aspirations of real people. For the viewers and listeners who have stayed through this full documentary journey, I hope this exploration has offered not only information, but perspective on power, on human resilience, on the long arc of history. And if you enjoy detailed, long-form documentaries like this one, consider staying connected and supporting more content of this depth. It helps ensure stories like this continue to be researched, written, and brought to life. The Soviet Union fell in 1991, but its echoes remain with us, in conflicts, in memories, in politics, and in the ongoing search for identity and stability across the region it once governed. Its story is not simply a historical episode. It is a chapter in the broader human struggle to balance power, freedom, and the pursuit of a better future. With that, this documentary reaches its conclusion, but the conversation about the Soviet legacy will continue for generations.